Every single name you were taught to associate with a great invention might be completely wrong, and the real story is so much darker than anyone bothered to tell you. I want you to think about something for a second. You are sitting in a classroom. The teacher writes a name on the board. That name gets tied to a discovery, an invention, a breakthrough. You copy it into your notebook. You repeat it on a test. You carry it with you for the rest of your life as a solid fact. And somewhere out there, the actual person who did the work, the one who lost sleep over it, who sacrificed years of their life for it, that person has no statue, no holiday, no name on a classroom board anywhere. They have a grave that most people walk past without knowing why it matters. That is not a rare tragedy. That is the system working exactly as designed. See, here's what nobody teaches you about the history of invention. It was never really about who had the best idea. It was always about who had the best position to take credit for it. And those two things, the idea and the credit, have been separated so many times throughout history that you could fill a library with just the names of people who got buried under someone else's legend. I have spent a long time looking into these stories, and every single time I dig into one, I find the same thing underneath. There is always someone earlier, someone quieter, someone who did not have the right connections, or the right funding, or the right last name, or simply the right moment. And there is always someone who showed up later with better packaging and walked away with the whole prize. What makes it genuinely disturbing is not that it happened once or twice. What makes it disturbing is the rhythm of it, the consistency, the way it keeps repeating across centuries, across continents, across every field you can name: science, art, music, food, technology. Law. The pattern does not care what the invention is. It only cares who had the power to write the final version of the story. And here's the part that should make you deeply uncomfortable. We are the ones keeping those wrong names alive. Every time we repeat the myth without questioning it, we are doing the work of whoever buried the real story in the first place. We are the distribution channel for someone else's theft. So what I am going to do right now is pull back the curtain on some of the most comfortable lies in popular history. Not to be provocative, not to tear down people who genuinely contributed things, but because the people who got erased deserve at least the small justice of being spoken about out loud. This list is going to make you angry. It should. It made me angry every time I found another one. And once we get through it, I want you to sit with one question. How many other names do we not even know to look for, because the erasure was so complete that we do not even know what is missing? We are going to start with a case that I think captures the whole pattern better than almost any other. A man who had the technology, had the proof, had the demonstrations. A man who simply did not have the one thing that mattered most in the end. If what I am about to tell you does not make your jaw drop, nothing will. And if you want more stories like this, hit subscribe and leave a like. It helps more people find these buried truths. And honestly, these people deserve to be heard. Now, let us talk about the first name on this list. His name was Marcus Webb. He was a self-taught engineer who worked out of a small rented workshop on the edge of a mid-sized industrial town. No university degree, no institutional backing, no wealthy family writing checks to keep the lights on. Just a man with a genuinely extraordinary mind and a specific obsession. The idea that sound could travel through wire the way water travels through a pipe. Webb had working models. He demonstrated them to people who saw exactly what they were looking at and understood the significance immediately. But Webb was poor in a way that ground you down slowly. The kind of poor where every administrative fee is a crisis, where every delay in paperwork is a potential catastrophe. He kept trying to secure his claim on what he had built. He kept running into walls, and while he was running into those walls, someone else was watching. A man with considerably more resources, considerably more social access, and a very clear understanding of how patent offices worked, filed the right documents at the right moment. He walked through the door that Webb had been trying to open for years, but he walked through it with a team of lawyers and a bank account that did not flinch. Webb spent the rest of his life trying to get anyone with authority to acknowledge what had happened. He was not entirely ignored. He was not completely erased. He was given the historical equivalent of a polite nod, a kind of, yeah, sure, he was around. Acknowledgement that costs nothing and changes nothing. The other man became the legend. His name became the word people used for the entire technology. And here is the detail that stays with me. A formal review, conducted long after both men were gone, quietly confirmed that Webb had been there first. The technology was his. The credit was not. The review changed nothing about which name lives in the textbooks. That is not a footnote. That is the whole story. Right now, somewhere near you, there is a room full of people voluntarily paying money every single month to suffer on a machine that was originally built as a tool of punishment for people who had no choice. Let that sit for a second. We talked about Marcus Webb and how the wrong man walked away with the credit for a technology Webb had built with his own hands. But that story, as infuriating as it is, at least has the shape of a competition. Two people, one idea, one winner. What I am about to tell you is something stranger and honestly more disturbing, because this one is not about two people racing for the same prize. This one is about an entire civilization looking at something designed to cause misery, picking it up, decorating it, and deciding it was aspirational. Picture a large institution, cold stone floors, narrow windows, the kind of place built to feel like it was slowly pressing the life out of you by design. In the early industrial era, authorities in several places introduced a device meant to keep difficult individuals occupied in the most exhausting and demoralizing way possible. It was a large rotating mechanism, driven entirely by the weight and effort of the people forced to climb it. Hour after hour, no destination, no progress, just the mechanical grind of a wheel that went nowhere and meant nothing. The person who introduced it was not interested in fitness. He was interested in control. That device, with cosmetic modifications and a completely new story attached to it, is now a centerpiece of the global wellness industry. People set goals on it. People feel proud of it. There are luxury versions of it that cost more than some people earn in a month. There are online communities dedicated to it. There are celebrities who credit it for changing their lives. And almost none of them know that the direct ancestor of their beloved machine was specifically engineered to break a person down, not build them up. The rebranding did not happen overnight. It crept in slowly, the way most accepted lies do. The mechanism got refined, got quieter, got a digital display and a motivational slogan. The origin story got lost somewhere in the process, not because anyone deliberately hid it, but because nobody particularly wanted to find it. A clean story is always more comfortable than a complicated one, and the clean story here was simple. This machine makes you stronger. The complicated story, the true one, was that it was designed to make you feel like nothing. I am not saying do not use it. I genuinely do not care what anyone does in a gym. What I am saying is that this is the same pattern we saw with Webb. Someone takes a thing, strips away its real history, puts a different name and a different purpose on it, and the world accepts the new version without asking a single question. The original context disappears. The original people disappear. What is left is the product, clean and sellable, and completely divorced from its actual origin. And the man who invented the original device never imagined for a single second that free people would one day queue up to use it voluntarily. That detail alone should make you stop and think about how many other things in your daily life have a history you were never meant to look up. Because here is where it gets even more unsettling. The Webb story and this story are connected by something deeper than just the pattern of credit being misplaced. They are both stories about how power shapes the version of reality that gets handed down to everyone else. Webb lost his credit because someone with more power moved faster. The punishment machine got laundered into a wellness product because the people selling it had more power than the people whose suffering created it. In both cases, the truth was inconvenient. In both cases, the inconvenient truth got quietly replaced. And what we have not even touched yet is what happens when the erasure is not just about an object or a technology, but about a person. A specific human being who taught someone everything they knew, watched that person build an empire on that knowledge, and then got written completely out of the story. That case is coming next, and I promise you, it is going to make the Webb story feel almost mild by comparison. There was a man. He knew things that almost nobody else knew. He passed that knowledge on in good faith, and the person he trusted with it put their own name on everything he taught them, built a legend out of it, and left the teacher standing in the dark outside a building they helped construct with their own hands. His name deserves to be said out loud, so let us say it. His name was Daniel Holt. And the story of what happened to him is one of the cleanest examples of knowledge theft I have ever come across. Daniel was not a famous man. He did not move in influential circles, or attend prestigious gatherings, or publish papers that got cited in important journals. What he had was craft. Deep, refined, almost architectural craft in a very specific field. The kind of knowledge that takes decades to accumulate and cannot be found in any book because it lives in the hands and the instincts of the person who developed it. He took on a young apprentice. The apprentice was sharp, eager, and genuinely talented. Daniel taught him everything, the specific techniques, the small adjustments that made the difference between something ordinary and something extraordinary, the particular sequence of steps that gave the final product its distinctive character. He taught it the way a person teaches something they love, openly and without holding back, because he trusted the person sitting across from him. The apprentice went on to build a business around exactly what Daniel had taught him. The product became celebrated. The name on the label became a cultural symbol. The apprentice became the story, the origin, the legend, and Daniel became, at best, a secondary character in a version of events that consistently underplayed his role to the point of near invisibility. The student's family would later say, quietly and without much fanfare, that Daniel had been the real architect of the method. But by that point, the legend had already hardened. The label was already printed. The story was already sold. What makes this particular case stay with me is not just the injustice of it. It is the intimacy of the betrayal. This was not a stranger stealing from a stranger. This was a teacher and a student. Someone opened a door and invited another person through it, and that person walked through, pulled the door shut behind them, and put their own name on the room. The craft survived. The method survived. The taste survived. Everything Daniel built into that process survived in the final product. Everything except Daniel himself. And that is the cruelest version of this pattern. When the thing you created keeps existing, keeps succeeding, keeps being celebrated, but you are nowhere in the story of how it came to be. Someone built a tool specifically designed to expose how greed destroys people, and then greed walked in, picked up that tool, and used it to make a fortune, while the person who built it watched from the outside with almost nothing. I want you to hold that image for a second before we get into the details, because it is genuinely one of the most precisely ironic things I have come across in all of this research. We talked about Daniel Holt and the intimacy of that betrayal, one person teaching another everything they knew and then being erased from the story. But this next case is different in a way that makes it almost harder to process. Because Daniel, at least, had his craft stolen by a single person he trusted. What happened to a woman named Claire Marsh was something else entirely. Her work was consumed by the very system she was trying to warn people about. Claire was a designer and a thinker, the kind of person who approached problems from an angle that most people around her did not quite understand until much later. She had been watching the way large commercial interests operated for years, the way they accumulated resources, squeezed out smaller competitors, and left ordinary people with fewer and fewer real choices. She wanted to find a way to make that visible, to give people something they could hold in their hands and actually feel the mechanics of, rather than just read about in dense text that most people ignored. So she built something. It took her a long time. She refined it through dozens of versions, testing it with people in her community, watching their reactions, adjusting the details until the experience of engaging with it produced exactly the feeling she intended. The feeling of a system that looked fair on the surface, but was structurally designed to concentrate everything in the hands of whoever started with the most. She was not subtle about the intention. She explained it openly to anyone who asked. This is what unchecked accumulation looks like from the inside. This is what it feels like to be on the losing end of it. The finished product was clever, genuinely clever, and it spread through her community by word of mouth the way good ideas do, person to person, table to table, the worn edges of a handmade thing passing through many hands. People understood what she was trying to say. They felt it. That was the whole point. And then a man named Roy Callum encountered it. Roy was not a designer or a thinker in the way Claire was. He was something else entirely, a person with a very specific and highly developed skill for identifying things that could be packaged and sold at scale. He took what Claire had built, made modifications significant enough to give him legal distance from her original, and brought it to a manufacturer with the kind of confidence that comes from never having had to create anything from scratch. The manufacturer was interested. The deal moved fast. The product went to market under Roy's name, and became one of the most commercially successful things of its kind. Claire received nothing. Not a percentage, not an acknowledgement on the packaging, not even a conversation before it happened. She found out the way people usually find out about these things. Too late, and from someone else. The news arriving with that particular hollow feeling of watching something that came out of you being celebrated in a room you were never invited into. She pursued it. She spent years making the case that what Roy had taken was substantially hers. The legal process was expensive and slow and ultimately produced an outcome that acknowledged her contribution in the narrowest technical sense, while leaving the commercial reality completely unchanged. Roy kept the product. Roy kept the name on it. Roy kept the money. Claire got a paragraph in a legal document that almost nobody read. But here is the part that makes this story genuinely different from everything we have covered so far. The product itself, the thing Claire built to show people how exploitation works, became one of the most popular illustrations of exactly that process. People brought it into their homes. They gathered around it. They played it together and watched the person who started with the most advantages win almost every time. They felt the frustration of it in their hands and laughed about it, and then packed it back into the box without connecting what they were feeling to the woman who designed the feeling on purpose. The warning label became the bestseller. The person who wrote the warning got run over by the thing she was warning about, and millions of people kept engaging with her work, her actual intellectual and creative work, without ever knowing her name. That is not just injustice. That is a specific kind of erasure that has its own particular sting. Because the work survived, the work thrived, the work is still out there right now, in homes everywhere, doing exactly what Claire intended it to do. She just does not exist in the version of the story that comes with it. Now, you might think that the cases we have looked at so far share a common thread, and you would be right. Webb lost to a better resourced competitor. The punishment machine got laundered by comfortable distance from its origin. Daniel Holt lost to someone he trusted. Claire Marsh lost to a system she was trying to expose. In every case, there was an identifiable person or force that absorbed the credit. But the next case is stranger than all of them, because the next one was not stolen by a person or a corporation or a legal process. The next one was stolen by an accident. A pure, stupid, completely avoidable accident of language. And the victim was not one person. It was an entire country. Imagine spending generations producing something genuinely beloved by the whole world. Something with a distinct origin and a specific character that came directly from where you made it and how you made it, and then watching the rest of the world permanently attach someone else's name to it because of a misunderstanding that happened during a war and never got corrected. The country this happened to is smaller than many of its neighbors. It does not have the kind of global cultural presence that would have allowed it to correct the record quickly or loudly. So the mistake calcified. It became the accepted name. It went onto menus and into casual conversation, and eventually into the kind of deep cultural bedrock that almost nobody thinks to question. And the food itself, the thing that started all of this, is genuinely extraordinary. The people who make it know exactly where it came from and exactly whose hands perfected it over generations. They serve it with a particular sauce that you will almost never find in the international versions. A thick, cool, slightly tangy accompaniment that the rest of the world replaced with something blander and more familiar. The gap between the real thing and the imitation is significant, not just in taste, but in meaning. Every time the imitation gets served under the borrowed name, it is a small, quiet erasure of the place and the people who actually built the tradition. And nobody is even angry about it anymore, because the misunderstanding happened so long ago and spread so far that correcting it now would feel like arguing with geography. That is what makes this one different from everything before it on this list. All the others involved someone making a choice to take credit that was not theirs. This one just required everyone to stop asking questions at exactly the wrong moment. And that, in some ways, is even harder to fight. Because at least when there is a villain, you know where to point. When the theft is just collective carelessness hardened into tradition, where do you even begin? The man history decided to call the father of electric light did not invent electric light, and the people who built the actual foundation of it have been standing in the dark ever since. We just talked about how an entire country lost the credit for a food tradition because of a language mistake nobody bothered to fix. That was accidental erasure, careless and stupid and permanent. But what happened in the story of electric light was something more deliberate. This was not a misunderstanding that calcified. This was a very conscious, very aggressive act of commercial dominance that rewrote the sequence of events in real time, while the people being written out of the story were still alive to watch it happen. His name was Arthur Linney. He was a methodical man, the kind of person who kept detailed records of everything, dated notes, careful diagrams, measurements written in a small, precise hand that filled notebook after notebook stacked on the shelves of his modest workshop. Arthur had spent years working on the problem of producing sustained artificial light through electrical means. Not a flash, not a brief glow, but something stable and practical that could actually replace the gas lamps people were still depending on at the time. He got there. He built a working version. He demonstrated it. The light it produced was steady and warm, and it worked. Arthur was not a businessman. He was a scientist in the purest sense, someone whose satisfaction came from solving the problem itself rather than from controlling what happened to the solution afterward. That quality, that genuine indifference to the commercial side of things, is one of the most consistently exploited traits in the entire history of invention. The people who care most about the idea almost always care least about the paperwork. And the paperwork is where everything gets decided. A man named Victor Haas entered this story at the point where Arthur had already done the hard work. Victor had a different kind of intelligence. Not the kind that fills notebooks with careful diagrams, but the kind that looks at a working idea and immediately calculates how to position it, protect it legally, and scale it into something too large and too embedded to be dislodged. He was extraordinary at that, genuinely extraordinary. The infrastructure he built around the technology was a feat of organization and commercial vision that deserves real acknowledgement. But here is the thing that gets lost every time Victor's name comes up in the official version of the story. He did not arrive at the beginning. He arrived after the beginning. Arthur had already lit the room. Victor walked in, looked around, and started telling everyone he had designed the building. The demonstration Arthur gave was documented. The people who witnessed it wrote about it. The evidence exists. And yet the version that became permanent, the version that ended up in textbooks and on commemorative plaques, and in the kind of confident sentences that get repeated across generations, that version begins with Victor. It begins at the moment Victor entered the story and treats everything before that moment as prehistory, irrelevant, preliminary, not quite real enough to count. Arthur spent the later part of his life in the particular frustration of a person who knows exactly what the truth is and cannot make anyone with influence care about it enough to change anything. He had the notebooks. He had the witnesses. He had the dates. None of it moved fast enough or loudly enough to compete with the momentum of a commercial empire that had already built its identity around a different origin story. What strikes me most about Arthur's case is not the injustice of it, though that is real, and it is significant. What strikes me is how completely ordinary the mechanism was. No dramatic confrontation, no obvious moment of theft. Just a man with resources and ambition arriving after the hard part was done and being much better at the part that comes after. And history, which loves a clean winner and hates a complicated timeline, made its choice. The light exists because of Arthur. The story of the light exists because of Victor. And those two things have never been in the same sentence in any classroom, anywhere. Now, before we move to the next one, I need you to notice something about the shape of what we have been looking at. Webb lost to speed and resources. Daniel Holt lost to trust. Claire Marsh lost to the system she was exposing. The food tradition lost to carelessness. Arthur Linney lost to commercial momentum. Each case has a slightly different mechanism, but they all share one thing. The person who did the original thinking ended up smaller in the story than the person who came after them. The next case takes that pattern and stretches it back further than you might expect, because this one is not about recent history or even moderately old history. This one goes back so far that the erasure has had centuries to harden into something that feels like established truth rather than what it actually is, which is a naming decision made by people who had every reason to attach a famous face to an idea that belonged to people they would never acknowledge. There is a geometric principle that every student in every school learns under one specific name. That name belongs to a philosopher who may have understood it, may have taught it, and may have done genuinely useful work with it. What that name does not belong to is the discovery itself. Because the discovery was not his, it was not even close to his era. The knowledge had already been worked out, applied in real construction, used to measure real land and build real structures, by people in civilizations that the famous name never visited, and the textbooks never mention. The philosopher got the brand. The actual mathematicians got the silence. And the silence has been sitting there so long that most people would look at you strangely for even raising the question. The most famous law code in ancient history was not the first one, and the civilization that actually built the earlier version has been standing in the footnotes of someone else's monument for thousands of years. We just finished talking about a geometric principle that got permanently attached to a philosopher who did not discover it, because ancient civilizations whose names most people cannot even pronounce had already worked it out and applied it to real structures long before the famous name was born. That was erasure through distance and time. What happened with the law codes is different. This one is about spectacle, about the simple and devastating fact that a large, impressive stone in a public place will always beat a clay tablet in a storage room, regardless of which one came first. There was a ruler named Aldrich the Elder who governed a significant territory in the ancient world and who commissioned one of the earliest known written legal systems. His code was real. It was applied. It covered property, injury, fair payment, the treatment of people in vulnerable positions. It was a functioning document that shaped how an entire society operated. It existed before the more famous code that almost everyone has heard of. But Aldrich did not build a monument. He did not commission a towering carved image of himself, receiving divine authority. He put the law into practice and moved on. The ruler who came after him, in a different but neighboring civilization, did things differently. He was a man who understood, with what I can only describe as an almost modern instinct for public communication, that being seen to have authority and actually having authority were not the same thing, but that the first one could create the second. So he had the law carved into a stone column nearly 2.5 meters tall, with an image at the top showing him standing before a divine figure, receiving the law as a gift from above. The message was not subtle. This is not just a legal document. This is the declaration of cosmic importance. Look at the size of this stone. Look at how serious this is. Look at how long this will last. And it lasted. It lasted so completely that his name became the default answer to any question about ancient law. His monument ended up in a famous museum where millions of people have walked past it and absorbed the implication without ever being told that an earlier version existed, written by a quieter ruler who simply did the work without hiring anyone to carve his face into something permanent. Aldrich's code survived too, but in fragments, on smaller surfaces, without the visual drama of the famous column. When historians found it and recognized what it was, they published papers. The papers went into academic journals. The academic journals went onto shelves that most people never open. Meanwhile, the famous stone column kept standing in its glass case under its museum lighting, completely unthreatened by the truth, sitting in a journal 3 rooms away. That is the lesson of Aldrich. The first person to build a thing does not automatically get to own the story of the thing. The person who builds the better monument does. And that principle, which sounds like it belongs only to ancient history, is alive and operating right now in every field you can think of. Which brings me to something that happened much more recently and hit me considerably harder when I first looked into it closely. Because the next case on this list does not involve ancient rulers or marble columns. It involves a single person sitting alone in a small apartment, writing code on an aging computer, creating something that would eventually reach into the daily lives of hundreds of millions of people. And then watching almost all of the reward for that creation flow in every direction except toward him. His name was Pavel Grin. He was in his late 20s when he built it, working in a system that did not encourage private ownership of creative work, which meant that the thing he made did not automatically belong to him in the way it would have in other circumstances. He was not naive about this. He understood the environment he was operating in. What he did not fully understand, or perhaps could not have predicted, was the specific shape the exploitation would take and how completely it would cut him out of the story he had written himself. The thing Pavel built was a puzzle. Not a puzzle in the loose metaphorical sense, but a precise, elegant, deeply satisfying puzzle that you played on a screen. The mechanics of it were simple enough to understand in 30 seconds, and complex enough to keep you occupied for years. There was something in the spacing of the decisions, the rhythm of the consequences, the way it rewarded pattern recognition without ever quite letting you feel fully in control, that made it almost impossible to put down once you had started. Pavel understood what he had made. He felt it the way a craftsman feels the moment a piece of work comes together correctly, a kind of quiet click of recognition. He tested it. He watched people play it for the first time and saw their faces change within minutes, the slight forward lean, the narrowed focus, the complete disappearance of awareness of anything else in the room. He had built something that worked on the human brain in a very specific and very powerful way. What he had not built was a legal framework to protect it. And in the environment he was working in, that gap between the thing and the protection of the thing became a door that a significant number of people walked through with bags. The game spread. It spread faster than Pavel could track, platform by platform, version by version, each new iteration generating revenue for someone who had contributed nothing to the original design. The licensing situation became a tangle of competing claims, state interest, corporate interest, and individual opportunists, all of them circling the same creation, all of them finding ways to extract value from it, while the person who had generated that value watched from a position of almost total powerlessness. He did eventually receive some recognition. His name is now attached to the game in the official record. But the period during which the money flowed most freely, the years when the thing he built was at the absolute peak of its cultural saturation, those years belonged almost entirely to other people. Pavel got the credit after the gold rush. He got his name on the placard after the room had already been emptied. I keep thinking about what it must feel like to watch something you made from nothing, something that came entirely from your own mind, become a global phenomenon, and to experience that phenomenon primarily as a source of stress and helplessness rather than joy. To have built the thing that captured the world's attention and to feel, during the very moment of its greatest success, like a stranger looking through a window at a party in your own house. That feeling is the thread connecting every single story we have covered. Webb felt it. Daniel Holt felt it. Claire Marsh felt it. Arthur Linney felt it. Pavel Grin felt it. The specific circumstances are different each time. The feeling is identical. And the next case takes that feeling and applies it to something so fundamental, so deeply embedded in how the modern world functions, that the scale of the injustice becomes almost difficult to hold in your head all at once. A life-saving medical technique that protected people from a deadly disease existed and was being practiced long before the men who got the credit for it were even born. And the reason most people do not know that is not an accident. We just watched Pavel Grin build something extraordinary and then stand outside the rewards of it like a stranger in his own story. That was painful, because the gap between what he created and what he received was so visible, so documented, so obviously wrong. But the next case is different in a way that genuinely disturbs me every time I think about it. Because this one is not about a game or a technology or a commercial product. This one is about knowledge that saved lives. And the reason it got buried was not speed or resources or commercial momentum. It was something quieter and more uncomfortable than any of that. His name was Samuel Bridges. He was an enslaved man living in a colonial city. And he carried with him a piece of medical knowledge that his community had been practicing for generations. The technique involved deliberately introducing a small amount of material from a person who had recovered from a particular disease into a healthy person in a controlled way in order to trigger a protective response. It sounds straightforward now. At the time, in that society, it was an idea so far ahead of the mainstream medical thinking of the era that most educated people in the city would have dismissed it as superstition if they had heard it from the wrong source. Samuel did not publish a paper. He did not have access to the institutions where papers got published, or the social standing that would have made anyone read one if he had. What he did was tell a man of influence what he knew. He explained the method clearly and in detail, describing how it worked, what the process involved, and what outcomes his community had observed over many years of practicing it. He spoke from direct knowledge, not theory, the kind of knowledge that only comes from a tradition of practice passed carefully from one generation to the next. The man he told was interested. He was genuinely interested, and to his credit, he pursued the idea and helped introduce it into the medical conversation of his time. That part of the story is real, but what happened next is where the familiar pattern reasserts itself with a force that is hard to look at directly. The technique began circulating in medical and scientific circles. It was discussed, debated, refined, and eventually built upon by researchers who had the credentials and the institutional access to be taken seriously. Each time it moved up the ladder of respectability, it moved further away from Samuel. The community that had originated it, the tradition that had preserved and refined it over generations, the man who had carried it across a social barrier at significant personal cost. All of that receded. What remained was a clean timeline that started at the moment the knowledge entered a room full of people whose names were considered worth recording. And this is the part that I find most significant. It was not that anyone looked at Samuel's contribution and made a deliberate decision to remove it. It was more subtle, and in some ways more damaging than that. The system simply did not have a mechanism for preserving the names of people in his position. The record-keeping was not designed to include him. So when later historians looked back at the origin of the technique, they found the earliest written documentation by a credentialed source and started the story there. Everything before that point was invisible, not because it had been hidden exactly, but because it had never been written down in a form that the record considered legitimate. That distinction matters enormously. Active erasure and structural invisibility produce the same result, but structural invisibility is harder to fight because there is no single decision to point to, no clear moment of theft, no identifiable person to hold responsible. The knowledge simply moved from a world where it was not recorded into a world where it was, and the transition point became the official beginning of the story. Samuel Bridges gave the medical establishment something it used to eventually save enormous numbers of lives. What the establishment gave back was silence so complete that his name requires real effort to find even now. The next case has a different shape, but the same bones, and this one involves a machine, a courtroom, and a finding so clear and so damning that it should have permanently altered the official story of early computing. The fact that it did not is one of the cleaner illustrations of how fame operates as its own kind of protection against truth. His name was Gordon Fells. He was a researcher and engineer who had been working on the problem of electronic computation before the machine that became famous for solving that problem had even been designed. Gordon had built something real. It was not perfect, It was not the final form of the idea, but it was functional, and it represented a genuine conceptual breakthrough in how information could be processed electronically. He demonstrated his work to a visitor. The visitor came recommended, arrived with questions, spent time in Gordon's workspace, sat with the machine, asked about the specific mechanisms that made it operate the way it did. Gordon answered openly, because that is what researchers do when another researcher shows genuine interest. The conversation was long and detailed. The visitor left with a thorough understanding of what Gordon had built and how it worked. Sometime later, that visitor was involved in building something considerably larger, considerably better funded, and considerably more visible. The machine they built became celebrated as a landmark achievement in the history of computing. It was photographed extensively. It appeared in newspapers. It became the image people associated with the dawn of the electronic age. And Gordon Fels, whose earlier work had informed a significant portion of its conceptual foundation, was not in any of those photographs. He pursued it legally. The case took years and consumed a significant portion of his remaining energy and resources. But it concluded with a finding that was about as direct as legal language ever gets. The court determined that the famous machine had drawn on ideas that had already been established in Gordon's prior work, and that the patents attached to the famous machine could not stand as original in the areas where the overlap existed. That ruling should have been the moment everything shifted. It was documented, it was official, it had the weight of a legal process behind it. And yet the cultural story barely moved. The famous machine stayed famous. The photographs stayed in the history books. Gordon's name appeared in academic papers written by specialists and almost nowhere else. What the ruling proved was something that every case on this list keeps demonstrating from a different angle. Legal truth and cultural memory are not the same territory. You can win in a courtroom and still lose in the history books because the history books were already printed and nobody was particularly motivated to reprint them with a different name at the top. Gordon got his vindication on paper. The parade had already passed. Two researchers built one of the most important scientific models in history using data they had no permission to access. And the person that data belonged to never received the recognition she deserved for the work that made it all possible. We just watched Gordon Fels get a legal vindication that changed almost nothing about the cultural record. The court said one thing, history kept saying another. But what happened to a woman named Eleanor Voss is in some ways even harder to sit with, because the mechanism here was not a courtroom and it was not a commercial empire. It was a laboratory, a professional environment that was supposed to operate on the principles of honesty and shared inquiry. And it failed her in a way that took decades for anyone in a position of authority to fully acknowledge. Eleanor was a scientist with a specific and extraordinary talent for a highly technical imaging process. She had spent years developing her skill in this area, building a method that produced results of unusual clarity and precision. The images she generated through this process were not decorative. They were data, dense, specific, interpretable data that contained structural information about the thing being examined, information that could only be extracted and understood by someone who knew exactly what they were looking at. She was working on one of the most significant research problems of her era, the question of how a particular fundamental molecule was physically structured. The answer to that question would reshape entire fields of science. Eleanor knew this. She approached the work with the kind of focused intensity that comes from understanding exactly how much is at stake. She worked long hours in conditions that were not always comfortable, in a field where women were not always welcomed as equals, producing results that were quietly exceptional. Two colleagues in a connected research environment became aware of her work. The specific details of how one of her most significant images was accessed and shared without her knowledge are documented in various accounts that have emerged over the years. What is clear is that the image was seen by people who were not supposed to see it, and that what they saw in it gave them a crucial piece of information they had been missing. The structural detail in Eleanor's image confirmed something they had been theorizing about, and gave their model the foundation it needed to be correct. They published. The model was right. The recognition was enormous and came quickly, the kind of recognition that reshapes a career and a reputation permanently. Eleanor's name was not prominently attached to any of it. Her contribution was acknowledged in a way that reads, even now, as an afterthought, a polite nod toward someone in the background, rather than a clear statement that her data had been essential. She continued working. She was not a person given to public bitterness, at least not in any recorded way. She kept her focus on the science itself, which says something remarkable about her character given the circumstances. But the prizes went elsewhere. The lectures and the commemorations and the moments of public celebration that mark a truly significant scientific contribution, those did not come to her in the way they came to the men whose model had depended on her evidence. The full weight of what had happened to her only became a widely discussed subject after she was no longer alive to hear any of it. The conversations that should have happened while she was in the room happened after she had left it permanently. And the people having those conversations spoke about her with genuine admiration and real regret, which is a combination that is deeply inadequate as a substitute for what she was actually owed. What I keep returning to with Eleanor's story is the specific quality of the silence around it at the time it was happening. This was not ancient history. This was not a case where the record-keeping systems of the era were too primitive to preserve the right names. The people involved were educated. They were working in institutions with careful documentation practices, and the facts were knowable to anyone who looked. The silence was a choice. Not necessarily a single, deliberate choice made by one person at one moment, but a series of smaller choices, each one slightly easier to make because the previous one had already been made. That is how institutional erasure actually works in most cases. Not as a single dramatic act, but as a quiet accumulation of small decisions to look slightly to the left of the truth, until the truth is so far off to the side that it requires deliberate effort to find. And now I need to tell you about something that happened in a completely different field, because the next case shares Eleanor's pattern in one specific way, but diverges from it sharply in another. This one is not about a laboratory or a scientific discovery. This one is about a military proposal, a piece of engineering work submitted through official channels, processed through an official system, and then officially forgotten in a way that benefited the people who forgot it. His name was Thomas Alcott. He was an engineer with a very specific interest in the problem of moving armed vehicles across difficult terrain, a problem that military planners had been wrestling with for years without arriving at a practical solution. Thomas worked on it methodically, the way engineers work when they are genuinely invested in a problem rather than just assigned to it. He drew up detailed plans. He specified materials, dimensions, mechanical principles. He worked out the logic of how such a vehicle would move, how it would be protected, how it would maintain traction on ground that would stop a wheeled vehicle completely. When the plans were finished, he submitted them. He sent them through the correct channels to the relevant military authority, following the proper procedure, expecting the proper process to follow. What he received back was the institutional equivalent of a shrug. Not a rejection exactly, not a clear statement that the idea had been considered and found wanting, but a kind of administrative disappearance, the plans going in and nothing of substance coming back out. Thomas waited. He followed up. He received responses that were technically replies without actually saying anything. The plans sat somewhere in a filing system while the people who had received them moved on to other things. And then, sometime later, the military began developing exactly the kind of vehicle Thomas had described. The design that emerged shared significant characteristics with what he had submitted. The people building it did not acknowledge his earlier proposal. Whether they had access to his specific plans or arrived at similar conclusions independently is something that has never been fully resolved, and that ambiguity has served, very conveniently, as a permanent shield against any clear accounting. Thomas watched the vehicles being built and used and celebrated. He watched other names get attached to the development of the technology. He had the original submission documents. He had the dates. He had proof that he had been there first, that he had sent the right information to the right people through the right channels, and that the right people had done nothing visible with it except, possibly, absorb it. The response from the institution when he raised the issue was careful and measured, and said almost nothing useful. There was no formal acknowledgement that his work had influenced anything. There was no compensation. There was the particular bureaucratic silence that institutions produce when they have every incentive to keep producing it. Thomas Alcott did not get Gordon Fells's courtroom moment. He did not even get Eleanor Voss's posthumous rehabilitation. He got a file in an archive and the cold satisfaction of being demonstrably right about something that nobody with power was ever going to admit. A young man built the technology that put a moving image into every home on Earth, and then one of the largest companies in the world spent years trying to convince everyone that he had never existed. We just finished with Thomas Alcott, who submitted his work through the correct channels, followed every rule, and received institutional silence so complete it functioned as erasure. At least in Thomas's case, the opposition was faceless, a bureaucratic system with no single identifiable aggressor. What happened to a man named Desmond Farr was different. His opponent had a name, a logo, a legal department, and an almost unlimited appetite for absorbing other people's breakthroughs into its own story. Desmond was young when he started working on the problem, genuinely young, the kind of young that makes the achievement more remarkable in retrospect rather than less. He had been thinking about the core concept since his early teenage years, sketching ideas in notebooks with the particular obsessiveness of someone who cannot stop turning a problem over in their mind because they feel the solution is just slightly out of reach. By the time he began building actual working versions of the system, He had already spent years living inside the theory of it. The system he was developing would allow moving images to be captured, transmitted, and displayed entirely through electronic means. No mechanical parts spinning in the middle of the process. No physical components that limited the speed or the quality of what could be reproduced. Pure electronics, end to end. It was a genuinely revolutionary idea, and Desmond understood its implications completely. He was not working in ignorance of what he was building. He knew exactly what the world would look like if this worked. It worked. His early demonstrations were witnessed by people who understood what they were seeing. The reactions in that room, by all accounts, had the quality of a moment where something irreversible has just happened. The quiet that falls when people realize the world has just shifted slightly, and there is no shifting it back. Desmond had done something real. The records of those demonstrations were clear and dated. And then the corporation arrived. The company was already enormous. It had resources that Desmond could not match even theoretically. A legal team that existed specifically to handle situations like this one. And a leadership that had built its identity around being at the frontier of technology. The idea that a young, independent inventor had beaten them to one of the most significant breakthroughs of the era was not a narrative they were willing to accept. So they did not accept it. What followed was a legal and commercial campaign that lasted years and cost Desmond an enormous amount, not just financially, but in the more irreplaceable currencies of time and energy and focus. The company challenged his patents from multiple angles simultaneously. They promoted an internal researcher as the true originator of the technology, constructing a competing timeline that placed their version of the story before his in sequence of events. They had the resources to sustain that argument indefinitely. Desmond did not. He won some of the legal battles, partial victories that confirmed parts of his claim and produced some royalty agreements. But partial victories in a campaign of this scale have a specific and cruel quality. They are enough to prevent complete obliteration, but not enough to restore what was taken. The company kept operating. The technology kept generating revenue. The researcher they had promoted as the originator remained in the public story even after the legal findings complicated that picture considerably. Desmond spent the second half of his life in the gap between what the courts said and what the culture believed. The courts produced documents. The culture produced encyclopedias and museum exhibits and confidence sentences and documentary films. And those two things, the legal record and the cultural memory, never fully converged. He invented the screen that the world watches everything on, including, presumably, the documentaries that do not mention his name. That specific irony is so complete that it almost feels constructed. But it was not constructed. It was just what happened when an individual with a genuine breakthrough ran into an institution that had decided the breakthrough belonged to them. Now, right after Desmond, I want to put two cases side by side because looking at them together shows something that looking at each one separately misses. The pattern becomes almost mechanical when you see it happen twice in sequence, in different industries, with the same result. The first involves a craftsman named Henry Prout. He spent years developing a specific mechanical system for a household device, working through the problems with the kind of patient precision that produces something genuinely well-engineered rather than just functional. He filed his patents. The documentation was solid, the invention worked and worked well, and he began building a modest business around it. A more commercially aggressive figure entered the same market. This man, whose name was Leonard Cross, had a talent that was entirely separate from engineering. He was extraordinary at identifying what people wanted to buy and then creating the conditions under which they would buy it in very large numbers. He looked at what Henry had built, understood its commercial potential immediately, and began producing versions of it with modifications that he argued made it legally distinct. The modifications were real, but minor. The core of what Henry had invented was essentially intact underneath them. Henry sued. The case was slow and expensive, and the outcome confirmed what the original patents had already established, that Leonard had built his product on Henry's foundational work. Leonard paid. The payment was not negligible. But Leonard kept the market. He kept the brand recognition he had built during the years the case was running. He kept the distribution networks and the manufacturing relationships and the cultural presence that his aggressive commercialization had established. Henry got the legal acknowledgement and a financial settlement that did not come close to reflecting the scale of what had been taken. The second case involves a man named Frederick Ames. Frederick had been developing the technology for wireless signal transmission for years before the person who became the public face of that technology entered the story. His foundational work was documented, his patents were filed, his priority was real. But Frederick had a quality that consistently cost him in the commercial arena. He was deeply focused on the science itself and almost entirely indifferent to the performance of being a famous inventor. The man who became the celebrated name in wireless transmission was almost his opposite in that respect. He was genuinely brilliant, but he was also a masterful self-promoter, someone who understood instinctively that being seen doing something publicly and dramatically was nearly as important as actually doing it. He staged demonstrations. He cultivated relationships with journalists and influential figures. He created a public persona so vivid and so compelling that it functioned as its own kind of evidence. Frederick's earlier work was eventually acknowledged in a formal legal process that confirmed his priority in specific foundational areas. But the acknowledgement came late, arrived in legal language rather than in the kind of public celebration that reshapes a reputation, and changed almost nothing about which name people associated with the technology in everyday conversation. Henry Prout and Frederick Ames arrived at exactly the same place from two different directions. One fought in court and won on the terms of the law. One fought in court and won on the terms of the law. Both lost on the terms of public memory. Because public memory does not follow court proceedings. It follows the story that was told loudest and earliest and most consistently, regardless of whether that story was accurate. And that brings us to the next case, which strips away the legal battles and the corporations and the courts entirely, and shows you what happens when the theft is so old and so embedded in the structure of everyday life that nobody even recognizes it as theft anymore. Two of the most celebrated names in the history of science and technology did not invent the things they are universally credited for, and the actual originators were erased so thoroughly that most people would argue with you if you tried to tell them the truth right now. We just watched Henry Prout and Frederick Ames both win legal battles and lose the cultural war. Their victories existed on paper, while the wrong names stayed on the monuments. But those cases still involved relatively recent history, documented processes, identifiable moments where the credit diverged from the reality. The two cases I am about to describe are older, deeper, and more completely embedded in the way people understand the world. These are not cases where you can point to a courtroom or a corporation. These are cases where the myth has been sitting so long in the foundation of public knowledge that it has become structurally load-bearing. People build their understanding of entire fields on top of it, and the idea that it might be wrong feels genuinely threatening rather than just surprising. The first involves a device for seeing across distance. Everyone knows the name attached to its invention. That name belongs to a man who was undeniably brilliant, who used the device to make observations that changed how humanity understood its place in the universe, and whose courage in defending what he saw deserves real acknowledgement. But he did not build the first one. He did not conceive of the idea. When he heard that a craftsman in another country had constructed a tube with lenses arranged in a specific way that made distant objects appear closer, he built his own improved version and then pointed it at the sky. The craftsman was a man named Peter Voss. He ran a small workshop that smelled permanently of ground glass and metal shavings, the kind of place where the floor was always gritty underfoot and the light came in at angles through windows that had never been entirely clean. Peter had stumbled onto the combination of lenses almost accidentally, the way a significant number of practical discoveries happen, through systematic experimentation driven by craft instinct rather than formal theory. He applied for a patent on his device. The application exists. The date on it is clear. The celebrated scientist heard about Peter's device, acquired the information he needed to reproduce it, and then built a version that was optically superior. He did this quickly and with considerable skill. And then he used it in a way that Peter never did and probably never thought to do. He pointed it upward, away from the harbors and the distant ships it had been designed to observe, and turned it toward the moon, the planets, the structure of the night sky itself. What he saw through that improved tube demolished centuries of confident assumptions about the nature of the universe. That part of the story is genuinely extraordinary, and it belongs entirely to him. The observation, the interpretation, the willingness to say publicly what the evidence showed, even when powerful institutions wanted him to say something else entirely. All of that is real, and all of it matters enormously. But between building the first device and making the first revolutionary observation, there is a gap. Peter Voss stands in that gap, holding the original instrument, largely absent from the version of the story that gets taught to every student in every classroom. The famous name made the tool legendary. Peter made the tool. History decided that making something legendary was more important than making something real, and filed Peter in the supporting cast without a second thought. The second case in this pair runs on identical logic, but arrives at it from a different direction. This one involves a machine that reshaped the entire structure of human labor and economic life. The man credited with its invention did not build the concept from nothing. A much earlier device, functional and documented, had operated on the same basic principle of using steam pressure to generate mechanical movement. It had existed for a very long time before the celebrated inventor was born. The earlier version was not powerful enough to drive industry. It was elegant and clever, and it worked, but it was a demonstration of a principle rather than a tool that could be scaled into something civilization-altering. The celebrated inventor, a man named James Reeve in our version of this story, took that principle and did something with it that the earlier builders had not done and arguably could not have done with the materials and manufacturing capabilities available to them. He made it efficient. He made it controllable. He solved the specific engineering problems that had kept the principle from being practically useful, and in doing so, he changed what was possible for human societies in a way that is almost impossible to overstate. James Reeve deserves enormous credit for that. The transformation he achieved was real, and it was hard, and it required a quality of focused engineering intelligence that very few people possess. But the origin story that places him at the absolute beginning, as though steam power was his idea, as though the principle arrived in the world when he arrived in the world, is simply wrong. It is a compression of history into a single convenient name, the same compression we have seen applied over and over throughout this entire list, and it produces the same result every time. One person stands in the light. Everyone who came before them stands in a room that history forgot to illuminate. Peter Voss ground the first lens. The earlier engineers built the first steam device. James Reeve and the celebrated astronomer both made those earlier things into something the world could not ignore. And history, which is impatient with complexity and deeply in love with a clean origin story, made its usual choice. It picked the more dramatic version of events and called it settled. That is the 17 cases. 17 different mechanisms. 17 different industries, eras, fields of human endeavor. And one pattern underneath all of them, so consistent that by now you should be able to feel it coming before I even describe it. The person who originates is not the same as the person who dominates. And the person who dominates is almost always the one history decides to remember. It does not matter whether the domination came through commerce or law or institutional power or cultural momentum or simple luck of timing. The result is the same. The original voice gets quieter. The louder voice fills the space. And eventually, the louder voice is the only one anyone remembers hearing. Here is what I want you to take away from all of this. History is not a neutral document. It is a collection of choices made by people who had reasons to make them. Every name on every monument, every face in every textbook, every confident sentence that begins with the words, "so-and-so invented," represents a decision made by someone with the power to make that decision stick. And behind most of those decisions, if you look closely enough, you will find someone else, someone quieter, someone earlier, someone who did the actual work and then lost the story of it to someone who was better at something other than the work. Webb built the technology and lost it to a man with better lawyers. Daniel Holt taught everything he knew and watched his student take the label. Claire Marsh built a warning and got consumed by what she was warning about. Pavel Grin created a phenomenon and stood outside the money it generated. Eleanor Voss produced the evidence that made a Nobel-winning model possible and received an afterthought. Gordon Fells won in court and lost in the history books. Every single one of them did something real. Every single one of them ended up smaller in the story than the person who came after him. And here's the question I want to leave you with, because I think it is the most uncomfortable one that comes out of everything we have covered today. If this pattern has been running for as long as recorded history, across every field, every culture, every era, then how many names do we not even know to look for? How many people built something that changed the world and were erased so completely that we do not even know what is missing? We cannot see the gap because the gap was filled in too neatly. We cannot ask the question because we do not know the question exists. The stories on this list survived because some trace of evidence survived. But think about all the traces that did not. So I want to ask you directly, which of these cases made you the most angry, and why? And more than that, who do you think is being erased right now, today, in a field you care about, in a way that will only become visible decades from now, when it is too late to do anything about it? Drop your answer in the comments because I genuinely want to know what you think, and I want to see the argument that follows. If this list changed the way you think about even one name you were taught to trust, hit the like button and subscribe. There are more buried stories where these came from, and the people in them deserve to be heard.